Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I would like to thank you all for joining us today for our discussion, Building and Mobilizing Women's Political Power with Dr. Stephanie Nouwen. My name is Gabrielle Sheets, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. I'm a current senior at Michigan State University, double majoring in social relations and policy through James Madison College, and women's and gender studies with a concentration in sexuality and conflict violence through the College of Arts and Letters. I'm also pursuing a minor in LGBTQ+ studies. Before we begin the discussion, for those of you who are new to Zoom, I would like to direct you to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You may use the Q&A button to submit any questions you have at any point of the webinar. We will keep track of your questions and be sure to address them to our speakers here today after their presentation. I would also like to let you know this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel within the next few days for those who could not make it today, or if you would like to watch it back at your leisure. The only faces that will be shown today and on the recorded version are those of the presenters, so you do not have to worry about your camera or microphone. I would now like to introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Stephanie J. Nouwen is the co-director for academic programs at the Center for Gender in Global Context, the GenCen, and an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at Michigan State University. Her research and teaching expertise are in gender, migration, and refugees, with a focus on refugee resettlement and the international protection of Syrian and other refugees in the Middle East. Nouwen was a Fulbright Fellow at the Women's Research Center at Istanbul University during the 2013-2014 academic year. Dr. Nouwen has co-edited Gender Through the Prism of Difference and the Routledge International Handbook of Migration Studies. Her most recent articles were published in Journal of Refugee Studies, Journal of Ethnic and Racial Studies, and Journal of Immigrant and Minority Health. Currently, she is leading a project exploring how humanitarian organizations are attempting to reduce COVID-19 infections and service provision to refugees in Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. As co-director of academic programs at the GenCen, Dr. Nouwen oversees the Women's and Gender Studies academic programs at MSU. She works with faculty across campus to offer Women's and Gender Studies major, minor, and LGBTQ+ and sexuality minor. She also directs 3 graduate specializations: Women and Gender Studies, Gender, Justice, and Environmental Change, and the Graduate Specialization in International Development. She led the organizing committee of the gender-sponsored conference last November, Gender, Women's Suffrage, and Political Power, Past, Present, and Future. She's also leading a collaboration between the GenCen, the Michigan Women's Commission, and the Minority Politics Initiative in Michigan State University's College of Social Science on a project to build a database on women's participation in local electoral offices in Michigan. As part of her role at the GenCen, Dr. Nouwen engages with different units on campus to improve gender and sexuality equity at MSU, always with an intersectional lens.
Thank you so much, Gabby, for that introduction. And I want to first welcome everyone today and thank especially Christine Radke and Marcia Medina for inviting me, and Cindy Wright and Monica Shelberg for making all of this magic happen. And of course, I want to thank you, Gabby, for agreeing to handle my Q&A and that introduction. So I will start I'm going to do what I hope is a more engaging PowerPoint presentation. I have been doing these a lot with my students, and wanted to start out with something that I often do with my undergraduate students, taking them through some of the early history of women's involvement in electoral politics in the United States. Oftentimes, students and the general public think of this as something that's very recent, and actually there's a very long history of women's political participation. So I'm going to go through this a little bit like I would in one of my lectures. I'm gonna ask you who you think the first, whatever was that happened, and all of you sitting at home, try to guess if you know the person, or maybe you can guess what year this happened. So the first woman legally allowed to vote, this often surprises my students. It was not someone who voted after the 19th Amendment passed, which gave women in the Constitution the right to vote at the federal level. The first woman to vote was Lydia Chapin Taft in 1756. So before the United States was even the United States. The first woman identified voting, she voted in a town meeting in a New England metropolitan election in the town of Uxbridge in the Massachusetts colony. So Massachusetts wasn't even a state, and we already had women participating in electoral politics. The first conference on women's suffrage was in 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention, which most historians point to as the beginning of the first wave feminist movement and the women's suffrage movement. But remember that the 19th Amendment didn't get passed until 1920, so it was many, many years of organizing that started out really at the Seneca Falls Convention. The first woman to run for the US House of Representatives was actually in 1866, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She, of course, was one of the organizers of the Seneca Falls Convention. I believe she received 24 votes out of the over 12,000 that were cast. So it wasn't a wildly successful election, but she did throw her hat into the ring back before she could have even voted for herself. The first woman presidential candidate was not Hillary Clinton, of course. It was actually Victoria Woodhull in 1872. Victoria Woodhull was a stockbroker and a publisher, and ran for president of the United States on the Equal Rights Party ticket. So not one of the major political parties, but a smaller third party. The first introduction of a constitutional amendment granting women's suffrage actually took place in 1878. So about 30 years after the Seneca Falls Convention, but another 40, over 40 years before it actually got passed. The first state to allow women to vote, most of the time, my students guess that this is some liberal state in the Northeast of the United States, but it was actually in Wyoming in 1890. Many of these Western states that were still very much frontier states back then, women took on roles that they didn't in other places because they had to. This was Wyoming and other states like it were places where everybody had to sort of dig in, and women were taking on leadership roles that they wouldn't have access to, maybe in more so-called liberal states like Massachusetts or New York. And then the first woman actually elected to US Congress was Jeannette Rankin. In 1916, she was from Montana, and she became the first woman elected to the United States, to Congress, before women, again, were allowed to vote. So all of this history precedes the 19th Amendment and the ability for women at the federal level to vote. There is, if you're interested in these stories and more, many more, there is at Rutgers University, they have the Center for American Women in Politics, and they have this really great timeline where you can see all the notable women that did all sorts of different things with setting the history for women's politics. And I'm hoping that these slides can be made available later so that you can easily just access this and click on that link or copy and paste it into your browser. So a lot of the first women involved in electoral politics in the United States were white women. White women had access to power organizing that women of color largely did not. But women of color were very much involved in early organizing for women's rights, despite the fact that the suffrage movement was sometimes very hostile to women of color. Many of the leaders in the early suffrage movement were actually against the 15th Amendment, were against giving Black men the right to vote before white women had the right to vote. But Black women and other women of color were involved in that effort and involved in early political history. So just a few I wanted to highlight. Soledad Chacon. She was from New Mexico. She won the New Mexico Secretary of State election in 1923, becoming the first woman of color elected to a statewide executive office. There is Crystal Dreda Bird Fawcett, who in 1938 became the first Black woman elected to a state legislature. Patsy Takamoto Mink, who was the first woman of color elected to Congress, to the US House of Representatives. She actually became the first Asian Pacific Islander woman elected to a state legislature when she won a seat in the Hawaiian State Senate in 1962, and then became the first woman of color elected to Congress in 1962. And then someone who is actually, I think, quite well known is Shirley Chisholm. Shirley was the first Black woman elected to the US legislature, and the first woman to seek a major party nomination for president. She won her seat in Congress in 1969. And then in 1972, the year I was born, she ran for president in the Democratic primary. She did not win the primary, but she got a really impressive number of electors given all of the barriers that she had to face. She was denied access to the debates originally. She got very little support from many Democrats, including many Black men, which including the Black caucus in Congress, the Congressional Caucus, and generally, you know, was had to overcome so many barriers. Ended up getting significant votes though in California and Ohio, and her slogan for her presidential campaign was "Unbought and Unbossed." So those are just a few really notable women who have broken down all sorts of barriers. Thinking about that history of Lydia Taft Chapin voting in 1756 to our Vice President Kamala Harris. There's a long, rich line of history of women breaking all sorts of glass ceilings. There are still, though, a number of glass ceilings we're working on breaking. Globally, we have very, very few women who have been heads of government or heads of state. Women serve as the head of state or government in only 21 countries right now, and 119 countries have never had a woman head of state. And then, of course, that includes the United States. At the current rate we are going in terms of adding new countries that have women heads of state, we are not going to reach parity for another 130 years. So it's been a very long slog, and not a lot of progress made on that front. Now, the government ministers, which would include the cabinet members in the United States, those positions also, very few women have held positions like that. Only 21% of government ministers are women, and only 14 countries have achieved 50% or more of women in their cabinet positions or government minister positions. And again, at this rate, we will not achieve gender parity until 2077. So a little bit closer of a finish line, but still very far away. There are more involvement of women in legislatures, and that would in parliaments. And United States doesn't fare very well in these, but globally we see more progress in this area. Still, though, only 25% of all national parliamentarians are women. That is up from 11% in 1995. And only 4 countries have 50% or more of women in their parliament, or lower house, which would be like our House of Representatives. Those 4 countries are Rwanda, which has 61% of their legislatures are women. Cuba has 53%. Bolivia, also 53%. And the United Arab Emirates has 50%. Now, you'll notice those are not countries that have reputations for having high levels of gender equity. And in fact, it's not because they have a culture that is, very pro women or very pro gender equity. It's because they actually have gender parity required by law. So after the Rwanda is a perfect example. After the genocide that occurred in Rwanda, they reconstituted their constitution, changed their government, and they put into law that at least 50% of their legislative body candidates had to be women. Some countries also will put a requirement for political parties to have a certain percent of their candidates be women. It might be 50% of all your candidates for elected office have to be women. And when we see those kind of gender quotas written in law, that's actually where we see gender equity in government. We don't see gender equity in government in places where there's just more gender equity across other measures like income or wealth, things like that. And of course, at the current rate of progress, we won't have gender parity in our national legislative bodies until 2063. So better than what we see with the heads of state, but there's still a pretty long way to go in terms of achieving some gender equity. Now, I'll turn a little bit and talk about kind of contemporary gender politics, specifically in the US today. The thing that is really driving a lot of the conversation about women in politics and electoral politics is white women's support for Trump. So in 2016, when Trump ran against Hillary Clinton, I think a lot of people imagined that Hillary Clinton's candidacy, of course, she was the first woman to be the candidate of a major party, right? Because Victoria Woodhull was the candidate from a third party. So Hillary Clinton is the first woman to run for president of the United States on the ticket of a major political party. And I think a lot of people imagined that she was going to get a lot of the votes from women, right? That she would, and in fact, she did win the majority of women, as most Democratic candidates have since 1980. Actually, we didn't always have a really big gender gap in among political candidates, but starting around 1980 with Ronald Reagan, we saw this kind of pull apart of who men are voting for and who women are voting for. And that has generally just increased. So certainly Hillary Clinton got the majority of women's vote, but she did not get the majority of white women's votes. And so this was really the first time on a national level where we started having this conversation about how it matters what the gender of the candidate is and what women are going to be mobilized by that, right? And so the gender gap increased a little bit, I think, well, actually, I take that back. It increased with Obama, and then it decreased a little bit with Hillary Clinton. So Hillary Clinton did not bring out a lot more women voting for her than previous Democratic candidates have. And then in 2018, there was this big wave, right, of Democrats winning elections largely from the votes of women, and a lot of those candidates were women. So there was this sense that there was a tide that was changing, that women, including white women, were looking more at women candidates, were motivated by this, and maybe also motivated to vote against Trump, who at that point was exceptionally, to put it very mildly, exceptionally controversial around gender politics. And what we saw in the 2020 election was not a big change. So Trump won 55% of the white women's vote in 2016. He probably won something very similar in 2020. The challenge of measuring votes in the 2020 election was that you couldn't really use exit polling very accurately because there were so many votes that were submitted by mail, or drop boxes because of the pandemic. So the exit polls indicated about 55% of white women voted for Trump. Later polls have pulled that number down a little bit, but it's still the majority or close to the majority. And so that gap didn't change much. And this led to a conversation of like, well, should progressive political movements or the Democratic Party even bother with trying to get white women's vote if it's going to be so unchangeable? And some people have pointed out, and particularly Black political organizers have pointed out, that white women are approximately 40% of the US electorate. And they still are this potential swing voter. So there's still this desire to kind of appeal to white women, but a lot of attention is being paid right now to like what's going on with white women who are sometimes voting against their own, economic interests, certainly often voting against their gender interests. But most analysts have looked at this and are coming to the conclusion that white women are voting based on race, that white women, the majority, it seems still, of white women, motivated by the white supremacy that Trump really embraced and ended up kind of representing, especially as we went into the 2020 election. And this one of the things we saw in the 2018 election was that women are running more and they're winning more. That there are a lot of women out there who are, regardless of who's on the ticket for the presidential election, at their congressional representative, their senators, at both the national level and the state level, women voters are paying attention to women candidates. And so 2018, we saw this very large number of women candidates winning at in US Congress, at the House of Representatives, and in the Senate. And the Republican Party paid attention to that. And so one of the things we saw, this figure is a little bit dated because it refers to January as if it's the future, right? And it's now the past. History moves fast. But the 116th Congress, which was the Congress that existed prior to the election in 2020, had 101 women, which was a jump, included 18 Democrats and 13 Republicans. That election in November 2020 changed that mix to 111 women, adding 10 more women. But you'll notice that most of that gain was not among Democrats. It was among Republicans. The Republican Party put up a lot more women than they used to, and a lot of those women ended up winning. So, I think it's an open question about whether that will change the politics of the Republican Party, and we can talk more about that in the Q&A. I'm actually a little skeptical because these, we're not seeing a lot of Republican women challenging some of the Republican Party platforms, we're not, the nomination, Gabby and I had a conversation about this last week, the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett, who, is a white woman, accomplished lawyer who is very much against, the legal backing of reproductive rights in the United States, has written a lot of legal decisions, legal, papers about how, this isn't constitutionally protected. And, whether or not that's a position that is anti-woman, or pro-woman. I mean, I think that debate continues to happen, but certainly the fact that women are in office doesn't automatically mean there's going to be certain policies that are supported, right? There's not, having women elected doesn't mean automatically that politics change. That and so we'll see what happens though with this. So these are all to me highlight the importance of women being engaged with politics, though, that we need to think not just, and again, not just any women, but women who who are motivated by creating a better world for their constituencies, by working on the behalf of those constituencies. And at Michigan State, we have these amazing students who, many of them I think would be great. They need to think about themselves as people who could run for elected office or serve in government. And so we've, at the Gen-Sen, we've really spent the last year, especially in 2020, because it was the 100th anniversary of the 19th passage of the 19th Amendment. We spent a lot of time thinking about how we can engage our students and our community stakeholders to think about themselves as people who are competent to serve, who have gifts and talents that should be shared. And so we've been focusing on that over this past year. And I just want to highlight a couple things that the Gen-Sen has been doing, and really this is some things that Gabby had mentioned in my introduction. So one of the great things about the Gen-Sen, we have our students and we have our affiliated faculty and staff, but we also have this wonderful community board of organizations in mostly in the mid-Michigan area, but we're looking to expand outward from that. And these organizations that do really important work that align very well with the Gen-Sen's mission. And one of those organizations is the Michigan Women's Commission. So the MWC came to Gen-Sen and said, we've got this problem. There is no data available on women running or holding local elected office in Michigan. That we know state level, we know national level, and these kind of data are available, but where women end up getting involved in politics is often the school board elections, or county commissioners, or they'll run for city council, or they'll run for mayor, and includes all of these elections happening all over the state, sometimes in very small towns. And this is where women are more likely to cut their teeth, to develop that experience that they go on to higher office. Of course, Gretchen Whitmer was a state representative before she became governor of Michigan. And this is really how women get involved. But how do we know what's happening if we don't have any data? So MWC came to the Gen-Sen, and I connected with some colleagues I had in the Department of Political Science, and we are currently working on creating that database where we will map out women who are holding local elected office, and ideally even women who are candidates. One of the issues is when you file to run, there's no box that indicates your gender identity or your sex category or anything. So we're having to compile that data manually. And it's a big project. I do want to give a shout out to Dr. Eric Gonzalez Yunque, who is got very, very excited when you can just tell a political scientist when I talked to him about we could create some data, and he just, I saw a little bit of drool on the corner of his mouth. He was so excited about it. So he's working with the GenSen to put that together. And then it was not only the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage. Last year was the 35th anniversary of the last time that Women in Gender Studies organized a conference, a really big conference around women's influence, and it was the 40th anniversary, I believe, of our gendered. Our working paper series in gender and development. And so we decided we're going to wrap all of this together into a big conference. And we had in late November, Gender, Women's Suffrage, and Political Power, Past, Present, and Future. This was a conference that we had been planning for well over a year, and of course had expected to be doing it in person. And that did not end up working. So we had a virtual conference that actually worked out really great. If you go to the GenSen's website, you can, our website is gensen.msu.edu, and you go under resources. We have that, the conference is up, all recorded. Almost every session we were able to record, and you can go back and see those. We really wanted to pay attention to that contentious history in women's suffrage, where there was women of color having to really advocate for themselves, and many leaders, white women who were leaders in the women's suffrage movement, were openly hostile to people of color, especially the idea that, well, white women should have the vote before men of color had it, and were not very supportive of women of color's involvement. At the same time, there was great cross collaborations. There were Black civil rights leaders who participated in the Seneca Falls Convention. We wanted to explore that history and then also look at contemporary movements. There's this connection, right? We're all kind of in conversation, people who are working to expand the rights of various peoples in the United States, in other countries. We wanted to kind of create those conversations and those connections. And so we were really, it was, exhausting to do that kind of thing in the middle of a pandemic, but I think it worked out really well. And one of the events that we had was we had a panel, a workshop on considering running for public office. What should you do? How do you get started? If you think you maybe want to get your name on the ballot, how do you make that happen? And so we had the co-founder of the organization VoteRunLead, which is one of our community board members, and also a member of the Michigan Women's Commission, Shannon Garrett. She came and gave a really great workshop, which is also included in the recordings, if you want to check that out, along with some comments from Governor Whitmer, who was able to come to the conference and speak for a little bit. One of our claims to fame, we had Gretchen Whitmer teach a class for the Women in Gender Studies program a number of years ago, back when before she was governor and got way too busy to do something like that. But so we really want people to think about them. We want women especially to think about themselves as this. This is something you can do. There's a real disturbing confidence gap with women that seems to be inhibiting them from thinking about themselves as people who can run for office. And you don't win if you don't run. We can talk about that a little bit more in the Q&A if people are interested, but for anybody who's just curious, I would really recommend you go to that recording of Shannon's talk, because it was very inspiring to me. I think, I don't want to come off as one of these people that's not very confident. I can't imagine myself running for public office, but when I listened to Shannon, I was there. Like, I really thought, even I could do this. So I think it's worth listening to her suggestions, not just for people who want to run for public office, but people who want to take on leadership positions. We need more women in leadership positions, and we can talk more about that, about why, if folks are interested as well. So again, there's just some information about how, if you're interested in learning more about the Jensen, um, there's some information here, how to connect with us on our website, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, all of that. And I'll make these slides available, so if folks want to check those out later, they can. And I will try to move things around so I can stop sharing. There we go.
Thank you, Dr. Nauman. That was a great presentation. I think we'll get started with the Q&A. Your first question is, why does it matter that when we get elected to high-level positions?
Yeah, well, so again, it's not that a woman in elected position is necessarily going to radically change things, right? Like, women are not a homogenous group, and but there's a couple important reasons why we need to have more women in elected office. Number one, representation is important, right? So there's good data on the effect that young people have when they see somebody who looks like them in positions of leadership, right? And this goes for all sorts of contexts. This is why it's important to have more diverse people in, say, movies and television, right? That that representation, being able to see yourself matters. Being able to see people like you in elected office gives you the ability to imagine yourself in those positions as well. And so greater diversity is going to help. It's gonna seeing women as leaders will help other younger women and girls imagine themselves as leaders. Second, there's something about people's lived experiences that they bring to the positions they hold in government that matter. That it's very hard for somebody who, for example, has never wondered where their next meal is coming from, being able to be at the table and think about how this law, this policy is going to affect folks who don't know where they're going to get their next meal. It's if you have never faced an unintended pregnancy or worried about an unintended pregnancy, it's hard for you to immediately think, how is this going to affect people who can get pregnant? How is this policy going to affect them? If you've never been primarily responsible for caring for children, it's not going to be natural that you're just going to come to the table and go, how is this thing that I'm considering right now going to affect people who care for children? So having more women at the powers of table matter, because women have different experiences than men, and having different kinds of women at the table matters, because not all women have the same experiences. So for example, the fact that we now have the very first Secretary of the Interior is an Indigenous woman, a woman who's not a white woman, a woman who has had to think about the policies of the US government and how it's affected Indigenous people, how it's affected land rights, how it's affected the resources that have largely been cut off from Indigenous communities. Having somebody who's sitting in the most powerful position in that agency, who has lived that, is really, really meaningful. It's really powerful. So that's the kind of, we want those different voices there, because ultimately we're going to end up with better policies, with better laws, if we have people at the table who are making them, who understand how they're going to affect everybody.
What change would you like to see for women in politics in the next 5 to 10 years?
Oh, wow. So many. I I think there's a lot that needs to be fixed about our political system generally, right? Um, there is, uh, the way in which campaigns are funded has been very problematic, and one of the barriers that we've seen for women running for public office is it costs a lot of money to anything beyond a very local level. It's expensive, and that's been a barrier for women because they're not as wealthy, they don't have as many wealthy connections. That's usually what kind of gets you started. Again, a plug for Shannon Garrett's workshop. She talks about how to do that. She talks about how to make those, how to put yourself out there and ask people for money. I think we need to think about how we fund elections and the role of large money, the place of money, right? And these large donations and these super PACs. I think we need to have better support for open journalism. We're our whole reporting of politics is very much about it's kind of what they call horse race, right? Who's winning in the polls, and there's less attention being, because that's what drives clicks, right? That's what drives these incendiary titles are what people check out. And we need to have better information, because when women run, they tend to run in ways where they talk about they tend to be more policy wonks. They talk about the ideas, they talk about the things that they want to institute. And I think fixing some of the ways in which we find out about candidates would actually create more gender parity. And I think we have to really commit to valuing gender parity. So I had those statistics in the beginning about it's going to take 185,000 years before we have gender equity and women heads of government and things. That's just based on how we've done so far. It could go a lot faster if we really work at it. It can also go backwards, and in fact oftentimes it does, right? We see the same thing with gender equity in the earnings gap, that the earnings gap among men and women in Michigan, for example, actually increased. It got worse between 2018 and 2019. And with the pandemic, it absolutely is going to get worse, right? There's not a natural evolution towards gender equity. Equity happens because we work for it. And so I think we need to really decide as a country, as a society, that we want this. We want those different voices at the table and do things that will make that happen, because it's not going to happen just naturally, right? It's not predetermined that things will get better. Things will get better because we work really hard to make them better.
Keeping on the topic of the pandemic, obviously we don't have the data on this yet, but how might you imagine the pandemic has affected women's role in the political world?
Well, I have really deep concerns looking at some of the numbers. There's one graph that I've shown on employment rates. So, not a lot of unemployed people running for public office. And so making sure that women have the opportunity to continue to get work experience and build expertise in the labor force is one thing, at a very basic level we have to think about. And the unemployment rates for women in the pandemic are really, really disturbing. Not just unemployment rates, but participation in the labor force. So there's two ways in which we talk about, people having jobs or not having jobs. If you are looking for a job, you don't have a job, but you're looking for one, you're considered to be unemployed. If you don't have a job and you're not looking for one, maybe because you've given up, um, or it's impossible for you to participate in the labor force, you are considered not in the labor force. You're not participating. And we've seen really steep increases in women just stepping out of the labor force entirely. And that's really because that's mostly mothers. For very obvious reasons. When you have kids who can't be in person in school, your opportunities for childcare are really limited, because you can't find somebody who can come into your home individually and do so safely, or having your own nanny is incredibly expensive. Even childcare in group settings is both expensive and very limited, and we've really failed, I think, as a country. We talk about family values and we do almost nothing to support families. And so schools have become childcare facilities, right? You send your kids to school, because you want them to have an education, but also school becomes this place where there's childcare provided. And a lot of schools, including the district my kids are in, had after school programs where they could be in a safe environment, continue to get some nurturing and some stimulation for a couple more hours after school lets out, so that working parents can continue to work. And for many families, all of that is gone. And so what has happened? Women have just given up. Like, I can't take care of these kids and work. Even if you're working at home, it's really hard to do that. And I have kids of my own. I have a 16-year-old and 12-year-old, and my kids are at the age where they need me, but they don't want me, right? They would rather I just ignore them and let them do whatever they want. And it still takes time for me. I'm keeping track of how they're doing in school and helping them with tech issues and helping them with things that they would have gotten help from their teachers before, but their teachers just physically cannot do any more than they're already doing right now. It's incredible what they've managed to do in this circumstances. And so I have it hard, and my kids are older. People with younger kids who really need, minute by minute help with online school, or they're young and toddlers or babies. It's too much for so many women. And so without being able to participate in the labor force, we are going to see withdrawal of those same people from running for elected office. So I'm deeply concerned about how this is going to impact the pool of women that we have available. And I hope, if I were a full-time political organizer, I would be thinking about how can I take, when all of this is as over as it's ever going to be, right, and we get back to some version of normal interactions, I would be thinking about what can my organization do to get those women who have been pushed into full-time caretaking during a pandemic, turn their accomplishment of keeping their families and their own heads above water, which, let me tell you, that is an accomplishment, turning that accomplishment into an argument for why they would make great political leaders. And I'll tell you what, you can keep your wits about you in this mess. I'll vote for you. I'll write you a check. Anybody out there thinking about running, keep me on your mailing list, because if you can manage your kids in this pandemic, you can manage anything.
I know we sort of talked about the financial aspect and just touching on the pandemic, but what do you personally think is the biggest barrier to women occupying positions of power or political office?
I think there's a number of things, right? So um, there's that confidence gap. So there's really it's shocking. The women are less likely to think that um, they are can competently run for public office, hold public office. They're less likely to think that they can do that compared to men who have the very same credentials, same educational levels, same work experience. Women are just less likely to see themselves um, as competent to do that kind of work. And then what I find most disturbing is there's a really large proportion of men who think they don't have the skills, that they're not qualified to run for public office. They still think about running for public office. They still consider it. Like, not being qualified doesn't stop men from trying to do things, but it does stop women. And so I think we need to think about two things. We need to think about I also, I don't think this is just something that, we need to fix about women as if women were the problems. Women certainly do need to be willing to risk things, even though they're not quite sure they're qualified to do it. But it would be nice if men who don't think they're qualified would just sit down and try to work on getting qualified, right, before you actually go and do something. So there's the confidence gap involves women being more confident and men maybe being a little bit more realistic. So you need to do that. I think there needs to be more mentoring. Women tend to run when somebody says to you, hey, have you ever thought about running? Right. And sometimes it's women who are out there leading the charge to address some problem. This is where you see a lot of women running for school boards. So women will be involved maybe in their child's school's PTA, or they'll be talking to other parents, and they'll be doing just volunteer work to try to make something better. They see some problem, and someone will say to them, you should think about running for the school board. Like, you've got some good ideas. And but it often takes being tapped. It often takes somebody saying, hey, have you ever thought about? And I think that is true of all sorts of leadership positions, that you know we need to look around. Those of us who are in leadership positions need to look around and go, who can I bring up with me? Who should I mentor to replace me? Or who should I mentor to join me at the table? And you if you the in MSU has something called the Women's Leadership Institute, and they brought in some big movers and shakers, these women who were like, very high up in large multinational corporations. And they were asked, like, about their career trajectory. And every single one of them said, well, someone, put their hand on my shoulder and said, hey, you'd be really good at this. Why don't you come along with me to this meeting? Why don't I introduce you to this group of folks? I think you should attend this training, and I'll help you I'll help you pay for it. I'll help you get it accepted into this training program, because you have potential, and I want to see you move up. And I think that's true for politics as well. And women involved in politics will say, I got here because I was mentored. There's a saying among African American women's organizing, lifting as we climb. And that has absolutely been the ethic that I've seen among Black women's political organizing. You're working to climb, but you're doing so as you pull somebody else up with you. And I think, it's great that individual people do that, but we have to institutionalize that too, right? And successful organizations, successful political organizing that has brought more diverse voices in, that's how they've done it. By having that ethic of who do we need to mentor, who do we need to bring in with us. So I think, those kinds of things should happen. And then, fixing some of the bigger issues around the fact that, like the US Senate has a disproportionate number of millionaires in it, right? We need to fix these kind of bigger structural issues around our political system that will make it more accessible. If you make it more accessible, you'll get more diverse people in there, including diverse groups of women.
Thank you, Dr. Nowin. I have been keeping an eye on the time, and it looks like it's almost 4 o'clock. With that being said, I would just like to thank you for speaking today. I really enjoyed learning about women's political power and the great work that you have done with the Jensen and the Michigan Women's Commission. I would also like to thank our attendees for taking the time out of their day to watch. It means a lot to have so many donors and alumni that care about the work and research at the College of Arts and Letters. I hope that you all have a great rest of the week, and go green.
Go white.